Firstly, just to say thank you everybody for joining. My name is Finn Tobin. I'm the Communications Manager here at ARB, and I have the honour of welcoming you all here today. As you may know, we've just begun the process of reviewing and revising the Architects Code, which is why we've gathered you all here today. We're going to open with a presentation from our Chief Executive, Hugh Simpson. He's going to talk about the code, its purpose, and why it exists. I'll then be calling on our Director of Policy and Communications, Rebecca Roberts-Hughes, and she's going to talk about the findings from a recent research report into public perceptions of the profession. We are going to have a Q&A then on both of those presentations, but we'll leave it until after both of the speakers have spoken. Once we've done all the presentations and the Q&A, we're then going to be moving into the workshop sessions. So we're going to be breaking off into breakout rooms. So just some really quick housekeeping before we start. So you'll have noticed, I'm sure, this is a Zoom meeting as opposed to a webinar. So if I could just ask that everybody keeps themselves on mute when they're not speaking, just so it doesn't get too chaotic. If you do want to speak, you should have a raise hand function on your screen, so please do use that. We are going to record today's session as well. So if you are uncomfortable at all with the fact that we're recording, please do let us know. We'll just be recording the workshop sessions. We won't be, the presentations, I should say. We won't be recording the workshops. If you can, and it's not there already, we also ask that you add your name and your organization to your name tag. Again, not essential, but it's just going to speed things up a bit when we're doing introductions in the workshop. And we are going to be running some polls today, so just keep an eye out for those when they flash up on your screen, and please do participate. So that's all the housekeeping, no more from me, so I'm going to hand over to Hugh, and he's going to speak to you about the code.
Thanks, Finn. Hopefully my sharing screen will work. No doubt colleagues will flag if it struggles. Hopefully you can all see that now. Yes, so good afternoon and thanks very much for joining. Yeah, I'm just going to spend a few minutes providing a little bit of context and background, both in terms of what ARB's responsibilities are within the code, but also a little bit of background in how codes of conduct and practice have changed over the years, and to provide some context for the discussions later about the different ways and the different topics that might change within the code, and setting out really our commitment to getting feedback about things that matter to the profession and things that you feel are critically important. So perhaps unsurprisingly, we'll start with the Architects Act 1997. And I've just in slightly scrawly underlining highlighted some things which I think are really important to highlight. So the first is that we have no choice. We have to, in law, issue a code laying out standards, and that we should keep it under regular review. And indeed, the last time we reviewed the code was in and published a version was in 2017. January the 1st, 2017, and anyone working in the built environment knows that 2017 was not a good year. The 14th of June 2017 was Grenfell, and so a lot has changed since then, and so it's certainly in our mind really important to review it. There's lots of things that we want to talk about, the positive opportunities the code presents, but in statutory terms, section 13 subsection 4, failure by a registered person to comply with the provisions of the code. Important to say, it should not be in itself taken to constitute unacceptable professional conduct and serious professional incompetence. So I think the important thing to do is it isn't, in terms of the legislation, meant to be a binary tool, a kind of strict liability. If you don't meet the code, it does not mean that you're guilty of unacceptable professional conduct, but it is relevant. So I think that's really just important to set out that the requirement for a code is in the law, but as I'll go on to talk about, there are a lot of other wider question marks about a wider purpose to the code, and some rhetorical questions here. So from our point of view, there are really three key audiences is here. So first, what and most importantly, what you, the profession, feel is the shared view about good conduct and practice. So the code, for it to have any credibility, needs for the profession to read it and go, yes, that reflects our practice, that reflects good practice, that reflects the things we aspire to do. And indeed, if you weren't complying with it, you collectively and individually would feel it is right for those behaviours or those practices to be challenged. The second, and I'll come to talk about this is a bit of a change, but critically, it's what users of public spaces or users of architect services have a right to expect from you. So in our view, the code is a public statement about what the profession itself feels public or users of architect services have a right to expect. So there's assurance to the public, and I think that's a kind of wider point about upholding confidence and setting the tone for the profession. And thirdly, again, for registrants and ARB alike, there has to be a shared understanding about the expectations of what we as the regulator of architects expect, and both an opportunity for architects to say that actually we've complied with the code, we complied not only with the letter of it, but the spirit of it, but also if serious or persistent, and I'll come on to talk about some of those, the terminology, failures to meet the code, to what extent might that reach a threshold for disciplinary action that is required, referring to those first two bullet points, to uphold the reputation of the profession or confidence of the public and safety. So how can the code be used? And I think it's important to say it has a lot of uses that go well beyond that very specific need of a public statement and a tool for disciplinary cases. So as many of you will know, that professionalism is taught in university as part of the introduction to architectural education and training. So it's a fundamental document that all aspiring architects will need to know and understand, but it also helps to inculcate professionalism. So we don't necessarily expect everyone to be able to recite the detail of the code throughout their careers, indeed. But if they are taught and educated with the code in mind, hopefully the key principles will come through and be part of everyday practice, which the majority of architects, the vast majority of architects, will meet. It provides clarity about the requirements for all those on the register. So if in doubt, a referral to the code can provide reassurance in everyday practice, but also, as I said earlier, to the public. That third bullet point, annual commitment, I think one of the things we've talked about before at ARB, and I think is consistent with all professional regulators, that registration with ARB is not just a paying of a fee and a confirmation of insurance and other sorts of things. It's an annual commitment to meet the standards and uphold the confidence of the profession. So there's an annual commitment, and that does refer to the code. It's a framework document, and that framework document could, for example, be about initial education training, or it could be other guidance and supplementary guidance, but it could also be a tool that others use, professional leadership bodies, for example, to build on. And lastly, but not necessarily leastly, by our professional conduct committee. So a failure to meet the code doesn't necessarily mean an architect is guilty of serious professional incompetence, but it certainly is relevant to the case, and the committee will always take into account the code. So the key message on this slide is that it has some narrow uses, but it also has some wider behavioural issues and certainly behavioural shifts and influences, we hope, in relation to what it's used for. So why review it? Is there anything wrong with the current code? Well, I guess it's I think it's implicit in all codes of conduct or educational standards or regulatory standards that they need to be kept current, and they need to be kept current for a number of reasons. I mean, not least, there's been changes in regulatory approach over the years. And I'll talk a little bit about an example from architecture in the past in the next slide, but there's definitely been a move away in regulators from a thou shalt not rules-based approach to a more outcomes-based approach. So, for example, requiring architects to be honest at all times. There are a couple of obvious reasons for this. I mean, I think one of the things that you can hear people with rules-based approaches talk about is that compliance-based approach. It takes people to the lowest common denominator. It lets the regulator off the hook because we don't have to make a more judgment-based approach. We can simply say, have you complied or not with the law or the rule? But it's far more complex than that in professional practice. The other benefit of an outcomes-based approach is it can help and encourage professionals to operate what you might describe as at the top of their license, to help them be the best that they can be in their practice. Changes in the practice of architecture. The practice has changed quite significantly over the years, and the code needs to reflect that. There are changes in society's expectations. So post-Grenfell and issues such as sustainability and climate change. So big questions for us about the extent to which that code needs to explicitly reference fire and life safety and sustainability, or at least certainly enable supplementary guidance that sits under the code, but some broader things in relation to society's expectations. And also we need to take into account data, and that data may come from complaints and PCC decisions. So the sort of broader question of what's going well within practice and what's going less well, and making sure that the code adequately covers those. So how has the code changed? So I think I thought it'd be quite interesting just to share what the code looked like in 1973. Just happens to be my year of birth. But this is what a rules-based approach might look like, and how it's changed. So if you see on the introduction, the code in those days was described very much as sustaining the dignity and the prestige of the architect. So very little talk about the public, some talk about clients, but I think there's definitely been a very big shift away from simply seeing it as a tool for the profession of the profession. And again, but even in those days, still very clear that as that second highlighted bit says, one ill-considered or hasty action may well bring discredit not only to the architect concerned, but the whole profession. So this concept that professional regulation is required so that the public can understand and have confidence in the profession as a whole. And I thought, what does prescriptive mean? A prescriptive code look like? Well, in this case, they've given the example of signage and signboards saying that an architect's name and affixes to his professional title may be shown at the entrance. And notice it's very much his office in letters not exceeding 2 inches in height. So I think we've probably moved on quite away from there. But I think what I hope comes across is there is plenty of different ways to both use a code, describe a code, and write a code. And that's why I think we feel it's really important to have these sorts of engagement events, as to get your views, not only in relation to what you think are really positive things that the profession should aspiring to, but also the ways in which we can use the code in future. So that's my last slide, Finn. So I will stop sharing and hand back to you.
Thank you very much. As I said at the start, if people do have any questions on that, we're going to take them after Rebecca's presentation. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca now.
Great, thank you, Finn. Can I just check that everybody can see that? Great, fantastic. Okay.
It's not in presentation mode, Rebecca,
okay.
But that's fine.
Try that again.
Yep, perfect.
That working? Fantastic. Okay, thank you. So this research has already been published, so some of you might be familiar with it, but we thought it was important to use it to set the context for today's workshop conversation. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of why we did the research and some of the key findings from it. So what we wanted to do was understand people's expectations of professionalism when it comes to architects, so that we could take that understanding forward into a new code of conduct. And the two research audiences that we commissioned an agency to look into, which I'll talk about in a moment, are not the only ones. So these aren't the only audiences we're talking to as we design a new code. They're the ones that we used research to reach. And that's primarily because if you think about small scale clients, so individual homeowners who've commissioned an architect, we don't know who they are. We don't have a contact base with them. So using independent research to reach those audiences is a really useful thing to do. So we're also contacting and having meetings with larger clients, representative groups and institutes, and architects directly. That's why this workshop is so important. So thank you for coming along today. Once we've heard from all of these different audiences, we're going to write the new code, drawing on what we've heard from them, and we will then publicly consult on it. So there will be another opportunity for people to have a say on the code before it's finalised. So a little bit more about those two audiences that this piece of research looked into. The research took place in two stages, and some of you will be familiar with research methodologies, but for those that aren't, I'll just explain those briefly. So qualitative research is about a detailed conversation, and it's a way of hearing from an audience in their own words. So for this, the agency used an online discussion forum and a workshop that was hosted in person. And whilst we had a range of characteristics and people from different locations within those two qualitative workshops, it's impossible with such a small group to reach a representative sample of the UK. Conversely, it's impossible to have a detailed conversation with a group that is representative. So the reason this research took two stages is that we heard from people in their own words, and then we used what we heard and tested it against the general population through a survey of over 2,000 people who were representative of the UK. So that's the way that we did the research. Small scale clients account for roughly 13% of the UK population, and the type of commission that the people that were involved in this research did, 66% of them had an extension done by an architect, 26% had renovation, and then 8% commissioned a new build scheme. And we know that small scale clients are more likely to be engaged with the architecture profession. They're more likely to follow news about architects, and they're more likely to take an interest in the local design and vernacular. Users of public space were 87% of the UK population, and these are people that visit public spaces or buildings that will have been designed by an architect. So 53% of them visited public spaces once or twice a month, and the others, it's much more frequently. And the most common spaces that they visited were parks, town squares, transport hubs, leisure centres, libraries and museums, healthcare buildings, and education buildings. So those are the people that the research agency spoke to. So in terms of the overall findings, the research found that the public assume that architects follow high standards of professionalism. And this is because they're aware that architects train for a long time, and this means that they think they're proven experts. And the people who've worked with architects, so the small clients there, they spoke really positively about the profession. They had really positive interactions with them. There was also a perceived absence of bad news. And what this means is that architects and the sector aren't necessarily front and centre of people's minds on a daily basis. So when there are negative stories about individual architects or the sector in the news, people don't really absorb that, and they don't think worse of the profession as a result of it. Thinks found that whilst there's an assumption that the standards are high, they're not perhaps considered by the public to be as high as other professions, such as those in the legal profession. And some people weren't sure about what sorts of forms of external accountability or regulation exist to help maintain those standards. So that's something that we as ARB are looking at and making sure that we've got more ways of contacting clients so that they know that we exist and what our role is. So in terms of the findings of the research that are going to feed into a new code one way or another, there were some values and some abilities that were identified as important. And remember that these are the views of the public and small clients. So these aren't ARB's views. They're not necessarily your views. This is what we heard from this particular audience. So the values are up on the screen at the moment, and each of them is illustrated by direct quotes from research participants. So at the top there is integrity, and this is about behaving honestly and not taking advantage of people who don't have the same level of expertise, who aren't necessarily experts in architecture, and it was about not cutting corners. And then commitment was about architects holding themselves to account for doing a job properly and to the highest standard that they can. Empathy was the third value that was identified in the research. And whenever we speak about this with people, the word can get quite a reaction. Some people really like it, some less so. But the sentiment that sits behind that word is one that perhaps might make a bit more sense. So it's around making sure that architects put themselves in the shoes of the end user or the client. So empathy might not be the right word, but the sentiment there is about an architect who cares about who's going to be using the buildings or the space they're designing at the end of it. There were also some abilities that the public feel are important, and these are on the screen now and they speak for themselves. So the abilities are about experts who have specialist technical ability and knowledge and who can translate that and unpack it and explain it to other types of audiences, which is why communication is so important there. We asked the agency to find out what matters most to the public when it comes to regulation. And so this question is based on our regulatory functions, which have been written by Parliament and are all intended to have a public benefit. So respondents to the survey could only choose one. So each person had to say what they thought the single most important aspect of architects being regulated was. And for 35%, it's that the profession is appropriately and highly qualified and has that specialist knowledge. For 23%, is that they have insurance cover to protect them and the client in case something goes wrong. And for 20%, is that there's a code of conduct that's there to guide behaviours. So again, all of these are important to somebody, but there's a clear indication there that it's about the expertise that's most important to the public. We also asked the agency Thinks Insight to explore 4 key themes for the code, and we identified those themes and asked them to ask questions about them. The reason we came up with these are that these are the themes that architects, architecture students, and academics raise with us across our surveys and consultations. So these 4 topics have come up both in relation to our education reforms and into the new CPD scheme, which we've launched this year. And we're thinking of them as specific competency areas or areas of professionalism that are most important. And each regulated profession will have something that's particularly important to the public, that's particularly relevant in light of their role and their expertise. So for legal professions, it tends to be trustworthiness and telling the truth. And for medical professionals, such as GPs, it's about the doctor-patient relationship and observing the right sorts of boundaries. So we wanted to find out whether there was anything in particular that was first and foremost for the public. And as you can see here, safety came out as the clear priority. So to give you a bit of an idea about what people said about this, 89% of the public agree that architects have a responsibility to make sure that buildings are designed safely and, for example, incorporate fire safety materials. Also, 89% think that architects should have guidelines in place to make buildings as safe as possible. And 87% think that it's important that architects take accountability of the decisions that they make relating to safety. So for comparison, looking at the second most important there, sustainability, 81% think it's important that architects take accountability for the decisions they make regarding environmental sustainability. So again, that's 81% compared to 87% for safety. And 77% of the public agree that architects should do what they can to advocate for higher levels of environmental sustainability. So that gives you an idea as to where those things rank for the public. A bit more detail on ethics, because of course this sits at the heart of a code. So on ethics specifically, the survey tested some of the sentiments and the beliefs that were raised by clients and the public in that first phase of the research, the qualitative phase, and tested those on the public. So everything you see on the screen here was generated by views of the public and clients and then tested on the general population. So 88% of people think that it's really important that architects show integrity and honesty. And this isn't just a moral judgment here, there's a really practical element to it. So this is about handling contracts properly, managing disputes if they come up, making sure that clients' money is dealt with appropriately. For 87%, it's incredibly important that architects communicate clearly. And then the other high scoring factors were about showing consideration to everybody that they work with, and the sector being a place where people feel comfortable and they aren't subject to a workplace culture of bullying or mistreatment. So those are the key points there. So that was a quick summary of the research that we've published. I took you through 9 slides. There are 57 pages in our published report. So if you're keen for more information, we'll circulate the link, and that's all available on our website. But for now, we'll move on and see if you've got any questions, either on the research that I presented or on Hugh's presentation about the role of the code. And if you could please raise your hand using the buttons, we'll be able to come to you.
So we might, one of the participants has messaged me, just direct message with a question. We might actually launch the first poll as well. So Molly, if you'd like to launch that poll now, just while you are thinking of questions. And Rosanna, if you're on the call there somewhere, if you would like to turn your camera on, turn your microphone on, and yeah, you can put your question to Hugh.
Where I am. Hello, can you see me, right? So hello, my name is Rosanna, and I did send a message to Finn because I didn't know that I could address the question directly. So that's why. So I'm happy to do that. So the question is for Hugh, and it's on the type of approach to the profession. So you were mentioning the compliance approach and the rules-based approach. The question is if you can expand on the compliance and rules-based approach, and perhaps with some projects as case studies.
Yeah, thanks, Rosanna. I mean, I guess, it's a really good question, quite detailed, but okay. So the way of looking at a kind of rules and a compliance-based approach, or an outcomes and a quality-based approach. So the idea is, if you set down a specific series of rules about what you must do or must not do, then it's very easy to measure. So the benefits of that kind of approach is, if you put up a sign and it's no more than 2 inches, you have either complied or you haven't complied. So that makes it quite easy from a regulator. It makes it quite easy from an architect's perspective to comply with that kind of code. The problem with that is it doesn't state, put a statement around quality or aspiration. So if you have an outcomes-based approach where you say, or a principles-based approach where you say, you must always act in your client's best interests, for example, as a statement, it's quite hard for us necessarily to measure, and it becomes a bit more subjective, but it does enable the professional to think, how do I demonstrate quality? How do I do the best job I can, rather than, have I done this thing that's set out in a code? There are advantages in different areas and different sectors. So for those sectors where you have a very much a so the example often given is the aeronautical industry, where a rules-based and a compliance-based approach is seen as really important in relation to a safety standard and a safety criteria. Professional regulation is generally shifted away from that compliance-based approach, because essentially you could see the profession as a bit of a bell curve. The vast majority of any profession are in that middle of a bell curve, trying to do a really good job, and you will have some people on the tail end and some people are leading, and I think our aspiration is to provide the tools and support to enable all architects to sort of maximize their potential. So that's a slightly long answer, but hopefully at least it gives Rosanna a little bit more of a kind of flavor in terms of the pros and cons of different approaches and what we're thinking.
It does. If you could think of any case studies, projects, or something similar that can be used to compare the two types, not fully, of course, but if that can be used to compare the two types of approaches.
Yeah, I'm sure there are lots of examples from other sectors, not necessarily built environment architecture, but I'm sure we can dig something out, and I'll try and forward something to you.
Thank you.
We've got Tim, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, hi. My name is Tim Clark. I'm actually speaking from Bavaria in Germany, which is where I'm based. I was on Monday this week. I was at a conference in Munich on accessibility, EDI, all of the things that are related to making public space enjoyable. We had a stenographer there who was working really quickly to make sure that every word was up on a screen. And I just wanted to make a suggestion for the future, that you organize some subtitles somehow. And you can get sound triggered subtitles, which would help, I think, everyone, even though you get some words that are put up that are not quite the ones that you wanted to have. I had a couple of comments on professionalism. I did a course on professionalism when I studied at the Bartlett, and that was really interesting because it's kind of an interpreted concept. And I think the word reputation always worried me at the ARB, that we're looking for, looking good in the face of the public, which is okay, but we're looking for credibility, I think, really, rather than reputation. We want from the inside somehow to assert that we're okay. We can do what we profess to do. That comment by one of the survey people, her neighbor who's an architect, is lovely. I mean, that's reputational appearance. I do think that there are some vocabulary and improvements that could be made, and and I just worried about the fact that you've concentrated on public space and small users for the survey, because really, when you look at Grenfell, we're looking at multiple occupation residential. And not all those people are going to have the money to employ an architect, but they may have some things to say about how architects perform. And I think that those kinds of dimensions of how we come across are very important, and not to use things like honesty. I mean, if we put words like honesty in our code of conduct, I mean, what are we trying to do? It's like, to be honest, I'm here, but everyone knows I'm here. But I think people want to have a little bit more depth to those dimensions of comments. And I do think that the multiple residential and also retail and commercial ought to have been trawled in that survey. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tim. So we're going to be going into breakout groups shortly, and everybody will have an opportunity to give their feedback on the values and the abilities as we take forward. But you've asked an important question there, which is, why did we only look at specific types of spaces? And in fact, it was more the other way around. So people, we asked them what sort of spaces they used, and those are the ones that came up. So we do know that in the earlier stages in the qualitative, there were people who lived in public housing and in high rises, and as you can imagine, some of the issues around safety were more prevalent to that group, and they were more aware of it and raised it. But yeah, so we did look at them, and we'll continue to engage with all of the different audiences who are interested. Has anyone else got any questions either about the research or about Hugh's presentation on why we have a code and what we're trying to do with it before we move into the workshop discussions? No, fine. All right, great. Well, I'll hand back to you then, Finn, because I think there's another poll, and then we'll be moving into the breakout rooms.